Okay, Dad, today is Friday, August 23rd, and let's start by talking about Russia and Ukraine, especially this Kursk incursion. I've been hearing a lot of analysts talk about how this is just a really big deal that Ukraine invaded Russia, and he's just saying that NATO essentially invaded Russia and the United States is behind this. But at the same time, I think a lot of people that haven't been following this conflict closely would be like, well, why is this a big deal? Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine has every right to invade Russia. The same thing when we talk about these missiles. It's like, well, Russia is invading Ukraine and launching, their air forces demolishing parts of Ukraine. Why do we get upset when
Mhm.
we let Ukraine use missiles and equipment to attack within Russia? They should be able to do whatever they want. They are the ones that are invaded. Is there something
Well,
wrong with this line of thinking? Why
well,
would you?
it's right up to a point. If it was just Ukraine that was carrying out this incursion, you could say, yeah, w- this is all's fair in war, right? In love and war, I guess is the phrase that goes, but we're talking about war. So anyway, um, but the problem here is that they cannot do what they're doing without the direct involvement of the U.S. and, in general, of NATO. NATO not only has supplied them with equipment, has armed them and trained them, but also provides them with intelligence, with satellite data, with satellite coordinate, GPS coordinates for their missiles. So, in other words, this is not simply a Ukrainian incursion, it's to a certain extent a NATO incursion. And that is a big deal. That that is something again that never happened during the Cold War. It's just that we always stopped short on either, on both sides of being of direct involvement in any kind of an incursion or attack on the other's territory. Of course, I'm talking about the Soviet Union versus NATO, and now it's happening. So this is an obvious escalation. Of course, this is not the first time this has happened. We've had we've had earlier instances of strikes into, well, minor incursions into Russian territory, and of course missile strikes and artillery strikes. The attacks on Belgorod using the vampire systems, for example, which killed many civilians. That was the vampire system is a checkmate system. Um, but this is a further escalation. Earlier, the U.S. had said, okay, we will now allow direct strikes into pre-2014 Russian territory by Ukraine using our missiles. But we're only allowing them to use certain missiles, like HIMARS, up to HIMARS, really. And it's only as a defensive measure. Now, you simply can't argue that this was a defensive measure. This was purely an offensive operation. And so went farther. We expanded. Before we're talking about just a response. What Ukraine was complaining about earlier, in reference to the Kharkov incursion by Russia, saying that, well, if we had had the ability to let me strike at, let's say, Russian ammunition depots or assembly points, we could have prevented or degraded Russian forces to the point where they couldn't carry out this incursion into Kharkov. So that was an argument that apparently we bought. Said, okay, we're talking about this. Russia crossed the border into Ukraine. You should have the ability to strike Russian forces on the other side. But this is not what happened here. So this is clearly an expansion. It's just something that we've seen along. We're constantly escalating. They're sort of salami slice escalations. They're not huge escalations, but we're forever expanding the scope of what's permissible. And so it is a big deal in that sense.
Are we getting close to the stage where we can say that NATO in the US is a co-belligerent now in this war?
Yeah, I
I
think you
mean,
can say that now. We're playing it's not really a minor role. I mean, it's a very important role because, of course, actually, Ukraine would have collapsed a long time ago if it wasn't um, for for funding and equipment supplied by NATO. funding by the EU and by the US, and then and equipment, of course, supplied by NATO. And if it wasn't for the training and everything else that I mentioned, we have been involved in many different levels. They would have collapsed. And now, we have continually escalated in many different levels. We've done things that we said we wouldn't do. I think it was back around the beginning, back in 2022, that Biden says, we can't supply tanks to them. What do you want? World War III, man? Something like that. And now we're well beyond tanks. It's F-16s and it's ATACMS missiles and it's a direct invasion on Russian territory that was clearly carried out with a certain amount. It's not clear exactly how much we're involved in it, but clearly we had to be. I think the British in particular, there's a bigger question mark about U.S. involvement. But yeah, it's so you have to say we're a co-belligerent. Again, they couldn't be doing these things without Ukraine couldn't be doing these things without NATO participation.
Do you think we've always been, to some extent, I guess, a co-belligerent? But did things really
Yeah.
change with this Kursk incursion? Was this an inflection point? Like you're in Russia right now. Have you noticed just a mood change on the ground with Russians after this incursion happened? They
Right.
are
Well, I
basically
can't,
we're at war with NATO.
yeah.
Is that how they feel,
Um,
or
Okay, I haven't had many conversations with with Russians. Actually, I've had the conversations in Chinese with Chinese speakers who are Russian citizens and are married to Russians. So I think I mentioned earlier that I had a conversation with a Chinese woman who is married to a woman. Married? No, 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 that doesn't happen here. I'm sorry. Married to a man in who worked in the Kremlin and he's now retired. But she was saying that he is just furious, and then she also went on to point out that that is a common um, sentiment. That's a common feeling among Russians in general. He says that we're really fed up. We're just frustrated actually with Putin for being so cautious. He says he's let this happen. It should never have happened. And then there has to be some sort of payback. And one person I've mentioned is Mark Sloboda, who I think is he's an American, but he's a Russian citizen and married to a Russian and very much got plugged into to what's going on. And it's clear, like he himself and the people know have the sense that, yeah, Russia really has to do something about it. We've let them go too far with this. Yeah, they have been escalating, but this is the point where Putin has to retaliate in some very open and dramatic way. To otherwise, well, you hear it actually, like in the Western press and among Western leaders, they're saying, well, look, we did all this talk about Russian red lines, and we got to be careful not to escalate. Well, we did this, and Putin didn't do anything. So that's just a bunch of nonsense. He's all a bluff. We called his bluff, and then we can just keep on escalating. Now that's very dangerous. So yeah, it's again, Russia's in a position that's similar to Iran, right? The other side's escalating. Um, Now, you don't want it to get out of control. You don't want to bring in NATO's clearly participating, but you don't want them participating much more directly by sending their troops in and fighting directly with the Russian army. But at the same time, you have to send a warning shot, or fire a warning shot, something to make it really clear that, hey, we do have red lines, and you have to stop escalating. So we'll see what he does. There's been talk, that there will be some sort of major retaliation, or more than talk. Actually, I think both the Chinese government and the U.S. government has advised their citizens to leave Ukraine. Because some sort of retaliation is expected, a major kind of retaliation. Again, maybe strikes on administrative centers, control centers within Ukraine.
okay? Yeah, I saw something that Putin or Russia released a statement saying that they'll bring anybody that was involved in this incursion to justice. And when I saw that, I was thinking, does that mean the U.S. and the UK, MI6 and
Yeah, I don't
CIA?
know.
Like,
Right. I think
Like,
it would he would try to keep it with no matter what within Ukraine, but it could be that he would target, for example, some sort of headquarters that's staffed by NATO officers, and they've kept that's been off limits. And they say, okay, well, you're doing this, you're invading our territory. There's no reason why we need to respect this boundary anymore. I could see that happen.
if that happens, how do you think the U.S. would respond? I mean, we're kind of hush hush about our presence there,
Right.
so they should be. These are NATO military officers and personnel directing this and orchestrating this war and this
Yeah.
offensive. So by all measures, they also seem to be viable targets. But it seems like
Right.
Russia has been reluctant to go after them and strike them because they are afraid that this will lead to further escalation, which they seem to be trying to avoid. But the U.S. and
Yeah.
NATO are constantly escalating. So
Right. Yeah. So again, you have to establish some kind of deterrence, and yeah, that requires some sort of meaningful retaliation. We'll
I,
see what happens.
I'm just kind of wondering I don't know what NATO's strategy is anymore. What is the game plan? Because this incursion into Russia, I guess they were trying to take the Kursk nuclear power plant and maybe use this as a bargaining
Yeah.
chip, but this failed. But it seems like it's clear that they are doubling down on this incursion.
Uh-huh.
This war is going to be won or lost on the Donbass on the eastern on the front there, not up in Kursk, but Ukraine's pulling what little troops it has off of this front line and going in doubling down on this invasion of Russia. So what is the goal? And can you first, is that true that they are doubling down, or they're committing more troops there? They're not trying to
Yes.
like,
Yeah. I mean, everything that I hear, they continue to pour in reinforcements. They're launching attacks daily, on the line of contact there. Um, yeah, they're and they seem to be actually perhaps planning to expand the incursion. There have been a lot of reports that they've assembled a fairly large force, I think, just to the west of um, of Kursk, where they made the incursion. So yeah, it does appear that they are doubling down. They're certainly not accepting defeat and leaving, and it's been costing them greatly. I think even the Ukraine supporters have admitted that the cost and equipment has been extraordinarily high. They're losing tanks and other armored vehicles at an extraordinary rate, at least double of what they usually experience on other parts of the line. Um, yeah, it's hard to say what the point is, and again, if you go into, let's say, the more serious minded media in the West, it seems like every day or every other day there's some sort of piece coming out that is questioning what they're doing, uh, because it does not make strategic sense. You can say, okay, tactically it was brilliant, but for a few days they caught the Russians by surprise. They embarrassed them, and they it was carried out with very imaginatively. They took control of cameras along the roads, and they had this disinformation campaign, and they did create a lot of chaos in those first few days, but it did not succeed. If indeed, and I think it's probably true, if indeed they were trying to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, they failed. They didn't come anywhere close, and it's not going to happen. So what are they doing? Well, I think we're seeing something that we've seen all along. It's just that for Zelensky and his people, this is always about the narrative, and it's always about the information war. And on the, let's say, the kind of the low information or low attention, um, uh, that media space, they're pumping out all kinds of stuff. I mean, if you just look at the headlines, it would just seem like, man, the Ukrainians are, again, they're just kicking Russian ass, and they're embarrassing the Russians day after day, and it's just like they've shown that the Russians are just a bunch of incompetents and cowards, and so on and so forth. Now, again, in the serious-minded press, they're saying, like, what the hell are they doing? They're actually losing a huge amount of equipment. They're suffering heavy casualties. They don't, one thing is they don't have the fortifications there that they do have down in the Donbass, where they they've dug in, they can hide, they can protect themselves from Russian attacks. Um, but here they're out in the open, so that's why these tanks and these armored vehicles and men are being killed at such an enormous rate. Again, because Russia has air supremacy. I mean, just stop and think about it, and think what it means. It's like kind of like Iraq. Again we had air supremacy, and there's just no place to hide. It was just a turkey shoot. So they're committing resources, men and equipment that they can't afford to lose, and they're losing them there. They're losing them at a very high rate. So what are they doing? Well, I think it's hard to explain what Ukraine does a lot of the time, because I think it really is irrational, and it's about the short-term media war. But maybe it's also the fact that, okay, Zelensky understands that he is losing this war, and he just has to do this wild roll of the dice. He has to do the Hail Mary pass. He has to do something to maybe elicit an overreaction by
That's
Russia.
that's what I was
Yeah,
going to propose.
yeah, or to demonstrate, like, well, you see this is happening. Okay, he did this. The Russians haven't retaliated yet. So if they don't retaliate, then you say, okay, look, he didn't retaliate. You can let me now fire missiles deeper into Russia. You can give me even more stuff. We can, and he can carry it forward. But then if the Russians do retaliate in some very meaningful way, then he can say, oh, once again, the Russians are crazy. It's another unprovoked attack on Ukraine. And of course, it'll be nonsense. It'll be retaliation after many, many escalations, but you know how it'll be reported in the Western press. And then he's hoping that through this, one way or the other, he can just draw in NATO.
Hmm. Right. I know. That makes sense, because this is a war of attrition, and if you're going on the offense into this Kursk incursion, you're just doubling the speed of attrition on your side, and this is
Right.
obviously what's been killing Ukraine. So they are essentially expediting their loss. They have finite equipment and finite manpower, and they're dwindling rapidly. And now they're being, like he said, it's a turkey shoot. They're out in the open. They don't have. Russia has complete air supremacy. So there is no tactical military sense in this incursion. But the only thing that I can think of is that this is something that could really boil the blood of Russians and people in the Kremlin to try to cause some type of overreaction. The last time Russia was invaded was when Germany invaded Russia, and 27 million Russians died. That's, I'm sure, ingrained into the memory and the psyche of every single Russian. And now here again, we have German tanks rolling in, and Ukrainians wearing World War II SS helmets and using Nazi symbolism inside of Russia. That could be deliberately to try to provoke an extreme reaction, because the only possible chance that Zelensky has is if he can get all of NATO to come in, to get Article 5 invoked, and then a full-on world war. We would probably still lose. It seems pretty because we don't have the capacity anymore militarily to wage, I think, a large scale war, especially.
And also we have commitments all over the world. We have commitments in the Middle East and in China, right. Yeah, well, I think you can see this is obviously analogous to what Netanyahu is doing.
I was going to bring that in.
Playing the same game, right? Now, I think Netanyahu is in a stronger position because he really is kind of America's the dog and he's holding the leash. That's the way he looks at it, and I don't think he's looking at it wrongly. Zelensky's hold on America is not quite so strong, but it's there obviously are people within the U.S. The State Department and within the Pentagon that do want to go farther, who do want to keep on escalating.
I think maybe it's more NATO. Maybe NATO is starting to feel that this is existential. Like you mentioned in the last podcast, that 75% of all military spending worldwide is NATO spending. NATO spends 75% of all military spending in the world is coming from NATO, and they're throwing everything they have at it, and their stockpiles are depleted. Germany can't produce artillery shells. Neither can we. It's an embarrassment. So they have committed themselves to this. Like you said, the
Yeah,
reputation is on the line,
right.
and I think they feel like they have to go all in and win. And so I think there's a lot of pressure from NATO to kind of keep it going. At least maybe the NATO leadership. I think
Um, right.
the maybe the ground everyday infantry soldier is thinking like I don't know about this. I don't want
Yeah, I
this, but
think
uh,
maybe you should look at another career, right?
mm,
Yeah, no, it's true. It's just, yeah, the big question is, yeah, they still have, are they actually going to send, are there going to be NATO boots on the ground? There already are, you can say either mercenaries in fairly significant numbers, especially from Poland. Um, and there are, you could say, what they call sheep dipped soldiers. In other words, NATO, let's say, uh, French Foreign Legion soldiers that formally resign their position and then they go to Ukraine and they act as mercenaries, but they really are um, still under the part of the command structure. It's really more a matter of yeah, just formality or appearances, but substantially they are NATO soldiers. But the numbers are small, are relatively small anyway, and it's not open. So if we'll see if they do eventually cross that line, and that's going to be the really scary moment when we if we get there. They may never do that, um, but they might. We'll see. Well,
mm. There's another story that's been going around that I'd like some clarity on, and that's about just what Ukraine's objective is with these nuclear power plants, the Kursk nuclear power plant and the Zaporozhye. Are they trying to create some nuclear disaster? I heard this coming from, I believe the Russian State Department made some type of a announcement, sort of just a theory that Ukraine is trying to create some type of disaster to invoke the use of nuclear weapons on Russia's side or some
uh-huh.
overreaction to try to pull in the West. Can you explain what's
Yeah.
happening with this?
Well, it's obviously crazy and reckless, um, but it appears that that's what they've been trying to do. I mean, they've been attacking, shelling, sending drones again, firing missiles at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant for a couple of years now, and they've done a fair amount of damage to it. And as a result, the Russians are forced to shut it down. I guess all of the reactors are in cold storage, or in other words, they're not operating. Um, but they just the other day, a couple of weeks ago, they did severe damage to one of the cooling towers. I don't think that really threatens it, but I think clearly they're trying to create some kind of incident. Otherwise, why do this? Um, and they just know that even though it's obviously obvious that they're the ones doing this, that they have the Western media on their side. The Western media has, by and large, gone along with the fiction. Maybe I know initially they actually tried to, just as with Nord Stream, pretend that it was the Russians are doing this to their own, to a nuclear power plant that they have under their own control. And then they just kind of went into, just sort of, oh, it's very confusing and who knows what's really going on. Yeah, clearly it was the Ukrainians all along. And that's what they've done recently. And the IAEA, has actually, that's the International, Atomic Energy Association. They have people there on site. And you can never get them to say, I think they've had instructions that you cannot announce that it appears that Ukraine is responsible for this. So they just say, oh, there was an explosion, damage. We don't know what happened. Um, so anyway, the Ukrainians see that, they know that, and if they can actually create some serious incident, or either by, I think it's really quite difficult, especially at Zaporozhye. My understanding is that the reactor core is um, very well guarded, or it's got tons and tons of concrete over it. It's almost anything short of a tactical nuclear warhead is not going to actually cause some sort of core meltdown or any serious leakage of radiation. But the one at Kursk, which they apparently attacked recently and may have been the object, the original objective of this Kursk incursion, um, does not have the same kind of protection. And it could, if struck directly by, let's say, a number of ATACMS missiles or something, there could be a real nuclear incident there. There could be, radiation could be leaked into the environment. Um, Now,
Sorry,
there's another
that's
possibility is, okay, this was just like a week ago. The Russians were saying that they were planning to fire a dirty bomb. So, a dirty bomb is it's not a nuclear warhead, but it's a warhead that's surrounded by radioactive material.
saying
And
the
so
Ukrainians were planning on
yeah, right,
firing this.
right. So they could fire it either at Kursk or at Zaporozhye. And even if they don't damage the reactor, radiation would be um, there would be a radiation cloud resulting from the impact, and then they could claim that this was something that the Russians are. Of course, it would be ridiculous,
I was
but
about to say that I'm
it's
trying
just
to
absurd, right? I
right. I'm
know,
trying to
because
make
it's
sense
beyond
of
absurd,
this.
right? I know it's beyond absurd, but you just look, you know, you say Netanyahu knows that he's got the Americans at his back, and they're always saying that, yeah, we have an ironclad. And Zelensky knows that pretty much, not 100%, that he's got the Western media at his back. So whatever he does, or he believes, he's fairly confident that whatever he does, they'll just, they'll obfuscate. They'll claim that somehow they'll just be, they're wordsmiths, the people at the New York Times and the whatever. They'll just come up with some sort of convoluted argument about why the Russians did this, and that this was clearly a huge provocation. They've gone nuclear, and that maybe this was a Russian false flag or something. They'll argue something like that. They probably almost certainly will. At least you'll have a lot of Western media doing this.
I just don't understand how you could ever spin that. I understand that the mainstream media, they're just propagandists for Israel and Ukraine, but and the deep state, but how would you spin that Russia decided to blow up its own power plant that it's controlling and it's running,
Yeah.
that that
Yeah.
Ukraine
Right.
is been shelling and attacking? I just don't understand how you
Yeah,
could.
well, they've done that. I mean, earlier it was Zaporozhye. Eventually, they kind of gave up on it, but for quite a while, they did that in the reports on the attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. They and then of course, remember they did that initially with the Nord Stream attack. Eventually, it was dropped, and they came up with this other absurd story, which they've continued to push. But um, So, if you asked me a couple years ago, I'd say, well, no, but it's just like anything seems possible now. It's just like there's so much, uh, there really just doesn't seem to be any kind of rationality on the Western side. There's only, um, it is all about a narrative, and the Russians are evil and the Ukrainians are good. So whatever happens has to be somehow forced into that narrative, and they'll find a way to do it.
It's just everything just reeks of desperation right now. What
Yeah.
Ukraine's doing, this Kursk incursion, these attacks on the nuclear power plants. It just seems like the one shot that Zelensky feels is that he has to try to escalate, and he's going to do whatever he can. Makes him a very dangerous person. How much longer do you think this can go on? Because he's, like you said, if he's doubling down, tripling down on this Kursk incursion, it just means that the Russians are
Right.
punching through more quickly now through Donbass,
Yeah, they
and
certainly are.
and they're just going to be ground up. And
Yeah.
all those men in Kursk, they're not coming home, or very few of them are. The best chance for
Yeah.
those guys are, I've been seeing videos of large, mass surrendering, because I think a lot of them are starting to realize, like, hey, this is a one-way ticket. We don't have any air support. We're in. What they're in a bunch of woodlands terrorizing villagers and capturing small towns. It doesn't see. It's like, what are you guys doing? I just don't
Right, right. They're
don't
not
don't get
even.
it.
They really, not really even towns. I mean, they're hamlets. Of course, you grew up in a tiny little. You could call it a hamlet in rural Tennessee. Population 35. I think it
I think
was
it was
30 when we moved
38.
there. Okay,
38.
maybe 38 now. Okay, but that's what we're talking about. I mean, seriously. So
Yeah.
these aren't really even. You can't really dignify them with the name of town. They're just.
Right. So what is the current status of this war? Do you see it coming to an end sooner rather than later
Well,
now because of this? It's
yeah, I think
expediting the end.
certainly sooner than it would have been uh, uh, if Zelensky hadn't launched this incursion into Kursk. He's speeding things up. I think he's going for all for nothing. It really is a desperation move, and it's it's clear. I mean, this is what we're getting reports from the Western press and the Ukrainian press that he pulled people off of the line in places like Pokrovsk, that area, which is that city, which is so crucial to the entire Donbass. When the Russians take Pokrovsk, and they're encroaching on it right now as we speak, um, that's really that's the end of the Donbass. It's going to be pretty rapid after that, because that's the main logistical center. Um, but they pulled some of their best troops off the line there, and also in Touretsk, again, another very important city. And the results are is that the Russians are just moving even more rapidly there. So the story that you still hear sometimes, I think I just saw another story, yes, another article yesterday that that this was done in order to divert Russian resources, from the Donbass to Kursk, is just pure nonsense. It's the opposite that's happened. And anybody who really understood what the situation was there knew that it would be, because, of course, the Russians have many more forces. And, because they've gone into Russian territory, actually, they've made it possible for the Russians to draw on even more troops than they could before. Because according to Russian law, um, the conscripts, couldn't be used within the conscripts could not be used in the Donbass. But in the case of an incursion, a direct attack on Russian territory, here they could. So actually, the Russians have been able to draw on their conscripts to defend in Kursk, and they couldn't do that before. So in addition to all the reserves that they had already, they now have the conscripts. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians are drawing their own, again, many of their best troops from the lines down there. So they are accelerating, the the defeat. They're bringing it rapidly, more rapidly, most definitely more rapidly than it would have occurred otherwise. We even have a member of the Rada, some woman who used to be considered a big supporter of Zelensky, but she's saying that she believes that Zelensky's basically given up on the Donbass. He's just going for broke with this crazy Kursk escapade, and he may, again, he may expand it. He may try to um, extend the incursion farther west, and it maybe get some more headlines for him. But it's just going to be, again, he's only um, bringing the end. He's he's accelerating the demise of his regime.
Well, how are other European nations looking at this now? Are we starting to see more countries starting to get cold feet, and the support for the Ukraine war is starting to wane? For example, I
Uh,
heard Germany recently, it seems to be a larger debate on whether or not we need to keep on sending money to Ukraine,
right.
especially in light of this, the Wall Street Journal story that came out again, sort of reinforcing the story that it was Ukraine that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline.
Right.
Some drunken people on a yacht story got
Yeah.
crazy,
Yeah.
ridiculous the notion story. But the Wall
Right.
Street Journal article
Right.
does mention Zelensky and Zelensky by name.
Right.
Saying not that they were directly involved, but at least complicit and aware
Yeah.
of this
Right.
event.
Right.
To
Well, they say
so
Zelensky was, yeah, initially supported and then went against it. It's so, yeah, no, that's interesting. And Germany has, Germany is the most fiscally conservative country in Europe. Um, and so that they take, budget deficits much more seriously than other European countries do. And they're seeing large budget deficits now. Now, they would be tolerable for many other countries like France, Italy. Um, but it is a hard pill for the Germans to swallow. They are fiscal conservatives, and so they have come out and said that really we've got to cut back on our support for Ukraine. It's not that they're not saying that it's because um, we're reconsidering this whole project, but rather that we just have to be honest about our ability to support it, our fiscal ability, and so that's what's happening there. And so yeah, that's significant. And then who knows what's like behind um, this most recent uh, SS Minnow story, its most recent incarnation. It may be that it was leaked by people who really do want to um, bring this thing to an end, want to pull out, reduce NATO's commitment. Um, I think that's quite possible. There is a factional battle going on within NATO.
Right. Means basically that there are two paths that we can take. Obviously, is that there could be a dose of realism, which hopefully we're seeing a little bit in countries like Germany, start to creep in at least,
Yeah,
and that this war can be resolved diplomatically. We pull
right,
support out and it's over. Or the other thing is you have this huge force with Biden administration and NATO that it's all about escalation. We can't lose no matter
right.
what.
Yeah,
And the more
right.
that
So
it becomes obvious that we're losing, the more irrational and extreme. I heard reports that they're to allow even deeper strikes into Russia now, that all bets are off or you can do whatever you
right,
want.
right.
That seems to be where we're heading. How much further can,
Yeah,
what
yeah,
what else can we do at this
right.
point?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing you have to point out is like this escalation, the fact that we keep on crossing these red lines that we've set, um, is a symptom of desperation. You don't do that. It's initially they say, yeah, we don't want to do that, but then you realize that you're going to lose, so you just have to try something more, and you just got to risk even more. That's what we see. So we have the risk takers, the escalators on one side, and then we have, I think, the realists on the other side, um, and we'll see who wins.
I think it's pretty much a toss up. So far, the people that escalate keep on winning, but it gets to a
Yeah,
point where it's
right.
like, are we willing to annihilate the human species, and go full
Yeah, and I
nuclear
think
war?
right. Again, I think that like when it really comes to say, okay, the last thing that we can try is actually sending boots on the ground, and maybe that's where a lot of people say, okay, let's be honest, guys, this just didn't. That's what I'm hoping. I think there's a real chance. Because again, like I pointed out before, when you look at, um, for example, defense budgets in places like the UK and Germany, they're not acting like they talk like they're preparing for war, and you do get very hawkish statements and very a lot of warmongering talk from a lot of these defense ministers and leaders of various countries. But then when you look at you you think that if they're serious about this, then okay, you'd be coughing up the euros for it, and you just don't see it. And in fact, again, like we see in Germany, they're finding ways to cut, and then they're playing these accounting tricks. Say, okay, well, maybe we can count like road building as part of our defense budget and keep within the 2%, commitment. So it doesn't sound like they're, when it comes down to it, that they're really serious about it. If you're serious about it, you would be, doubling, you would be increasing the defense budget. If you really think you're on the brink of war, you would be moving up to 5, 6, 7%, and that's just not happening, not at all. So I think that when it really comes down to that moment of truth, when they say, okay, we've tried everything, clearly we've lost this. Do we actually send our own troops in there? Do we invoke Article 5 on some pretense? I think that they're going to blink. That's just my guess, and they're going to step back and say, okay, this is it. Um, I hope I'm right about that. I know other
I think you
people
are.
are.
I just
Yeah,
don't see. I just don't see it. I don't see people rushing to recruitment offices to go fight in
yeah.
Russia. And then, like I said, a lot of people aren't really paying that close attention to the war. But once it starts to get to the point where you
Okay,
might be
yeah. I
called
might
up
get called up.
might get called up. You can just
Yeah,
start
yeah.
paying
It's like,
attention. You're like, wait, what
yeah.
is it? Why did
Wait a
this whole
second.
thing
Yeah,
start?
right. It's one thing to be a keyboard warrior. It's another thing to be actually be sent out to Ukraine and then have to deal with the drones and glide bombs and everything else.
Yeah, terrifying. There's no
Right.
way.
Yeah.
I'm off to Bali or something if
Yeah.
Okay, let's pivot over to the Middle
Well,
East.
I
Or do you have something
actually,
else you want to say?
I think probably, well, we're here again in St. Petersburg, and we have a dinner planned. I think maybe,
Cut it stop now.
yes, yeah, maybe it's a good time to stop now. And I'm getting kind of hungry, I'll be honest with you.
Okay. All right. Okay, yeah, all right. We can talk about Iran
Well,
and the Middle East on Monday then.
okay, very good.
Okay. All right. Well, enjoy your dinner, Dad.
Okay,
Okay, bye-bye.
bye bye.